Welcome, dear friends. Today we're going on a heartwarming journey as we explore the story of a widower who finds a second chance at love and family in the midst of his darkest hour. Enjoy the story. Steve Morgan stood motionless in front of the hospital nursery window, his eyes fixed on the tiny pink bundle squirming in the bassinet. A lump formed in his throat as he watched his newborn daughter Erin let out a feeble cry. Just 3 days ago, he had buried his beloved wife, Sarah, who tragically passed away after a grueling 2-day labor. The doctors had warned them about the risks of a high-risk pregnancy at Sarah's age, but she was determined to have a child. At 35, Sarah knew her biological clock was ticking, and she desperately wanted to experience the joys of motherhood. Despite the complications, the pregnancy had progressed smoothly until the fateful day when Sarah went into labor. Steve's mind flashed back to the moment when the doctor emerged from the delivery room, his face somber. "Mr. Morgan, I'm so sorry. We did everything we could, but we couldn't save her." The words had hit Steve like a sledgehammer, knocking the wind out of him. He had collapsed onto the nearest chair, his body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. Now, as he stared at his daughter, Steve felt a mixture of overwhelming love and crushing grief. How was he supposed to raise this child alone? How could he face the future without Sarah by his side? A nurse approached him, cradling Erin in her arms. "Mr. Morgan, it's time to take your daughter home," she said gently, placing the baby in his trembling arms. Steve looked down at Erin, her tiny face scrunched up in sleep. He knew he had to be strong for her, to give her the love and care she deserved. With a heavy heart, he carried his daughter out of the hospital and into the unknown. Martha, Steve's longtime housekeeper, was anxiously waiting at the front door when he arrived home with Erin. As soon as he stepped inside, Martha rushed forward, her arms outstretched. "Oh, let me see the little angel," she cooed, gently taking Erin from Steve's arms. "She's absolutely precious, Mr. Morgan, and she looks just like Mrs. Morgan, bless her soul." Steve's heart clenched at the mention of his late wife. He looked at Erin, trying to see the resemblance, but all he could feel was the overwhelming weight of his grief. Martha seemed to sense his distress. She placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I know it's hard, Mr. Morgan, but remember, this is your daughter. She's a part of you and Mrs. Morgan. You have to be strong for her." Steve nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I know, Martha, it's so hard without Sarah." "I understand, Mr. Morgan, but you're not alone. I'm here to help you, every step of the way." Martha's words were a small comfort, but Steve knew he had a long road ahead of him. 1 month had passed since Steve brought Erin home, and he was at his wits' end. Night after night, Erin's piercing cries echoed through the house, leaving Steve exhausted and desperate for a solution. He had called the pediatrician twice, seeking advice on how to soothe his inconsolable daughter. Dr. Larson assured him that Erin was perfectly healthy, attributing her constant crying to Steve's profound sadness and depression over Sarah's death. "Babies are incredibly intuitive, Mr. Morgan," Dr. Larson explained over the phone. "Erin can sense your grief through the innate father-daughter bond. My advice is to hold her close, take her for walks, and try your best not to be visibly upset around her." Steve sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. He knew the doctor was right, but it was easier said than done. Every time he looked at Erin, he was reminded of the love he had lost, the future that had been snatched away from him. Determined to follow Dr. Larson's advice, Steve began taking Erin for daily walks in the park near their home. He hoped that the fresh air and change of scenery would help calm her, and perhaps in turn, bring him some much-needed peace. During one of their daily walks in the park, Steve noticed a young girl, no older than 7, emerging from a hole in the fence. She had a mischievous glint in her eye as she skipped towards them, her tattered dress fluttering in the breeze. "Hi there," the girl chirped, peering into Erin's stroller. "What a cute baby." Steve smiled, surprised by the girl's friendly demeanor. "Thank you. Her name is Erin. I'm Steve, and you are?" "I'm Jessica," she replied, grinning. "I live in the orphanage on the other side of the fence. I like to sneak out sometimes just to explore." As if on cue, Erin began to fuss, her cries growing louder by the second. Steve reached for her, but Jessica beat him to it. "May I?" she asked, gesturing towards the baby. Steve hesitated for a moment before nodding. He watched in amazement as Jessica gently lifted Erin from the stroller, cradling her in her tiny arms. "Shh, it's okay," Jessica cooed, rocking Erin back and forth. "Sometimes babies just need to be held a certain way. Try laying her on her side like this." To Steve's astonishment, Erin's cries subsided almost immediately. He stared at Jessica, a mixture of gratitude and curiosity washing over him. "How did you know to do that?" he asked, marveling at the young girl's intuition. Jessica shrugged, a sad smile playing on her lips. "I used to have a baby sister before." She trailed off, her eyes clouding with emotion. Steve sensed there was more to Jessica's story, but he didn't want to pry. Instead, he offered to buy her an ice cream cone as a token of his appreciation. From that day forward, Steve and Jessica began meeting in the park daily. Jessica's presence seemed to have a calming effect on Erin, and Steve found himself looking forward to their encounters. As they spent more time together, Jessica slowly opened up about her tragic past, how she had lost her entire family in a devastating car accident just months earlier. Steve's heart ached for the young girl, recognizing the pain of loss in her eyes. He felt a strange kinship with her, two souls bound by the shared experience of grief. One afternoon, Steve arrived at the park with Erin, eagerly anticipating his daily meeting with Jessica. However, as the minutes ticked by, there was no sign of the lively young girl. Concern gnawed at Steve's gut as he waited, bouncing a fussy Erin in his arms. After an hour had passed, he decided to investigate, making his way to the orphanage where Jessica lived. The orphanage director greeted him with a grim expression, her brows knitted together in worry. "Mr. Morgan, I'm afraid I have some troubling news," she began, her voice heavy with concern. "Jessica was badly beaten by some of the other children last night. They were jealous of the gifts and attention you've been giving her." Steve's heart sank, a wave of guilt washing over him. "Is she okay? Where is she now?" "She's recovering in the hospital," the director replied, her tone softening. "But Mr. Morgan, I must caution you. Your visits with Jessica, while well-intentioned, may be doing more harm than good. She's already been through so much, and forming attachments only to have them severed. It's not healthy for a child in her position." Steve nodded, understanding the director's concerns. He knew he had to be careful not to give Jessica false hope, but he also couldn't bear the thought of abandoning her, not after everything she had done for him and Erin. In the days following Jessica's hospitalization, Steve found himself grappling with a decision that would change the course of his life. The more he thought about the young girl who had brought light into his darkest days, the more he realized that his path was inextricably linked to hers. With a newfound sense of purpose, Steve approached Martha, his eyes shining with determination. "Martha, I've made a decision," he announced, his voice steady. "I'm going to adopt Jessica." Martha's face lit up with a mixture of surprise and joy. "Oh, Mr. Morgan, that's wonderful news," she exclaimed, clasping her hands together. "I think it's a beautiful idea, and I know Mrs. Morgan would be so proud of you for opening your heart again." Steve smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over him for the first time since Sarah's passing. "I want to convert the guest room into a second nursery for Jessica. Can you help me with that, Martha?" "Of course, Mr. Morgan. I'll get started right away," Martha replied, her eyes brimming with happy tears. As Steve set about making the necessary arrangements for Jessica's adoption, he couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement and nervousness. He knew that taking on the responsibility of raising two young girls as a single father would be challenging, but he also knew that it was the right thing to do. When the day finally arrived to bring Jessica home from the hospital, Steve felt a flutter of anticipation in his chest. He entered her room, a bouquet of colorful balloons in hand, and was greeted by the sight of Jessica's beaming face. "Steve!" she exclaimed, her eyes widening with surprise. "What are you doing here?" Steve sat down on the edge of her bed, taking her small hand in his. "Jessica, I have something important to ask you," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "How would you feel about coming to live with me and Erin? Permanently, as a family?" Jessica's eyes filled with tears, her lower lip quivering. "You mean You want to adopt me? She whispered, hardly daring to believe it. Steve nodded, a lump forming in his throat. More than anything, Jessica. You've brought so much joy and light into our lives, and I can't imagine my family without you in it. With a cry of pure happiness, Jessica threw her arms around Steve's neck, hugging him tightly. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes, she exclaimed, her face wet with tears of joy. As Steve held Jessica close, he felt a sense of completeness that he hadn't experienced since Sarah's passing. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with Jessica and Aaron by his side, he felt ready to face whatever challenges life had in store. 1 year later, Steve stood in the backyard of his home, watching as Jessica and Aaron played together on a colorful picnic blanket. The sun was shining, and the air was filled with the sound of their laughter and the sweet scent of blooming flowers. Martha emerged from the house carrying a tray of freshly baked cookies. "Look at you, Mr. Morgan," she said, her eyes twinkling with pride. "A year ago, you were a man drowning in grief, and now look at the beautiful family you've created." Steve smiled, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Martha," he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You've been a rock for us through everything." As he watched his daughters play, Steve felt a sense of peace wash over him. He knew that Sarah was looking down on them from above, smiling at the family they had become. "Thank you, Sarah," he whispered, his eyes misting with tears. "Thank you for giving me the strength to love again, to create this beautiful life with our daughter and with Jessica. I promise to cherish every moment and to make you proud every day." With a heart full of love and a future bright with promise, Steve gathered his daughters into his arms, ready to embrace the joys and challenges of fatherhood, and to create a lifetime of precious memories as a family united by love, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds of the heart.